Katy Murzda is the advocacy coordinator with the Dilley Pro Bono Project. She has worked at the South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley, Texas for over a year and works as an advocate for immigrants and asylum seekers. After meeting with some of the women who were separated from their children earlier this summer, and these women who expressed a desire to tell the public what they were experiencing, Katy and her team collected 22 incredibly moving and painful letters now featured on the Dilley Pro Bono website. Katy is here to discuss her work and what she has observed and experienced working so closely with the families seeking asylum in the United States. Welcome, Katy, and thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me, Brad. I'm excited to be able to share these stories further.
So tell me, how did the U.S. government allow you to enter this detention facility and work with the immigrants?
While these families do not have government-appointed attorneys, they do have the right to an attorney if they can afford their own attorney or if there is a pro bono attorney willing to represent them. And so we come into the detention center, we have to seek a special clearance to provide legal services and go through security, and we're able to work with them.
So the Dilley Pro Bono Project is in essence pro bono attorneys along with coordination by you and others as well. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Right.
Some of our staff are attorneys, some aren't, but we're there to provide free legal services.
And you are down in Dilley, Texas now?
I'm in San Antonio right now. I work remotely part-time and then in Dilley part-time.
So where is Dilley, Texas, actually? I know it's in a remote area.
It's an hour and 15 minutes southwest of San Antonio. It's in a town with a population of under 4,000 people. And our groups of volunteers that come every week fly into San Antonio and then have to drive out there to this very small town to be able to provide legal services. It's about an hour north of the border, in the middle of nowhere.
So now earlier this summer, Trump and Department of Homeland Security were separating families. Were they being separated at this facility as well?
No, the families who were separated before they could ever come to this facility. The facility is only for mothers who are with their children, and so the separated families were sent, the mothers to adult detention facilities and the children to shelters for children. It was only later, once they were reunified according to court order, that it came to us.
I understand. So it's basically a family facility.
We worked with families after they were reunified, and they told us about how horrible it had been, but no, I didn't work with them while they were separated.
There's mothers and children in this facility. Can you describe what this facility is? I've read that they're huge cages. If you listen to Donald Trump, it's a beautiful school that the children are going to.
The worst conditions that you're hearing about, children who are in a cage-like facility, that's occurring on the border as soon as they arrive in the first few days. So the detention center, fortunately, the conditions aren't quite that horrible, but it still causes physical and emotional harm to the children. These are children who have already been traumatized in their home country, on the journey, and at the border. Still being in this detention center setting can be further traumatizing to them. We see a lot of behavioral changes in the children and children who aren't receiving the physical medical care that they need.
Do you have, as part of the Pro Bono Project, you provide lawyers, do you provide any sort of psychological counseling as well?
We're only cleared to be providing legal services, so we can't provide counseling. There is some available at the detention center, although we don't believe it's enough for the level of trauma that
I can only imagine.
Experiencing.
Now, how many families are actually in this facility at the moment?
So the capacity is 2,400 people. We are not given official numbers on any given day. I recently heard 1,200, but that number can go up and down frequently.
Okay, so the 1,200 people, do they get court hearings? Are your attorneys going with them to court?
We are there to help asylum-seeking families, most of whom come from Central America, but who can come from all over the world, go through the first step of their asylum process, which is a screening interview before they even get to court. And what we're advocating for is that families don't have to go to detention and don't have to go through this process and just go straight to a judge to make sure they get their fair day in court, because we believe these interviews can be very arbitrary. It can be very traumatizing for them to be in detention and go through this interview, and it's a waste of taxpayer dollars. But for now, we are helping them go through the interviews to make sure they get positive decisions and are released. So we prep each person for their interview.
And they're actually being detained unnecessarily. They didn't commit any crimes that I'm aware of. and there's a lot cheaper ways to, the only reason to detain them is to make sure they show up in court. And there's a lot of easier ways to detain somebody than detaining somebody to make them show up in court. They can put an ankle bracelet on and it would cost 1/10 of what it does to jail them. And it's apparent that Donald Trump is trying to discourage people from coming to America and applying for asylum. Do you see that happening, or do you still see people coming? You know, they have, you know, on Fox News, they got the caravan, you know, the countdown, 25 days, 24 days before we get invaded by the worst army in America. And it's basically women and children who are suffering from violence or escaping from violence and family misconduct.
What we see from working with asylum-seeking families is that they can't be discouraged from coming, because the only reason anyone would make this very difficult journey with a small child is if they believe that the child's life is in danger in their home country. And so people are coming out of necessity, and as long as they believe that their child could die in their home country, they're going to make this difficult journey and take the chance of seeking asylum in the United States.
And you can only imagine how bad it is for them there if they're willing to accept being in jail with their child here as a better alternative.
Exactly.
Jeff Sessions did make a decision a few months ago, I'm sure you're aware of it, that said that people who are escaping domestic abuse, it is not a claim for asylum anymore. That a lot of people were claiming that. Have you seen what's been going on with those claims in court? Are they on appeal in federal court? Are people making different claims now? What's going on with that?
Fortunately, we're working at the credible fear interview stage, and there we still have had our near 100% success rate. We have had to put some more time into helping the women prepare their stories. They have all of the information that's needed to pass the interview, but often they need a lot of explanation of the context of the interview, which parts of their story are important, practicing giving specific examples, explaining how they know why they can't depend on the police for protection, because that type of thing is just such a given for them that they've never had to explain it to someone. So we've been taking more time to make sure the women understand the new standards.
Does the mother and child live in a jail cell together, individual jail cell, or is it a group home where you have many people living in one room? What actually does it look like inside?
They're staying in bunk beds with several other families in the room, but it does feel like a jail. There's a tall fence all around it. The daily schedule is very regimented, with children as young as 1 year old having to eat at certain meal times without flexibility for different children's behavior and routines. The children will sometimes say, you know, we're in jail, we're locked up. They know that they're not at a summer camp, and their behavioral changes
Sure.
and trauma display that. The guards that are inside the facility don't have guns on them, but they do behave in a manner where correcting the mothers for small behaviors, you know, stepping out of line, not following all of the rules, which are often hard to keep track of and
Sure.
feel like they're changing. And that really changes the structure of authority in a child's life, when previously, you know, they were depending on the mother to be the one in charge, and that can have significant
Sure.
psychological consequences.
So are there other services besides, you know, having family counselors to help children and mothers? What else is lacking there?
We're extremely concerned about the inadequate medical care in these facilities. We hear from families who are waiting for hours just to have a medical appointment when their child is very sick. We hear that they've taken them to the clinic multiple times, and the kids haven't received the medicine that they believe they need. We've seen kids rushed by ambulance or helicopter to the hospital 70 miles away in the city of San Antonio. We're seeing people who have to wait in 100 degrees outside, waiting for their prescription every 4 hours to give their child. There's no specialist here. So people who need to see a cardiologist, a gynecologist, any type of specialist are often told they have to wait until they're released.
Is Dilley a privately for-profit detention center, or is it a government-owned detention center?
It is for-profit. It's operated by Core Civic, a private corporation, which is a contractor of the U.S. government.
And their one goal is not to help anybody in this facility. Their one goal is to give the least amount of services possible to make the biggest profit as possible.
Right. Our concern is that no one should be making a profit off of asylum-seeking families.
You're absolutely right. So now, Is there anything that you and your organization can do or are doing? I know besides the legal help.
We're limited in what we're allowed to do in the detention center, but yes, it does often feel like we have this responsibility of being the only person that this person has ever entrusted with their story. Many of our volunteers and staff hear a particularly traumatic story of death threats or sexual assault, and the client tells us, I've never told anyone that before, which is why we need to make sure we spend the time and make sure that they feel comfortable with us and
Right.
tell us everything relevant to their story. But it can be very, very sad and difficult talking to the families and hearing everything they've gone through.
So now your organization, the Dilley Pro Bono Project, you collected 22 letters from different women who were detained at this Dilley detention center. Was it designed to help? Was it designed to bring, some perspective on what's going on there?
The reunified families had been detained for months and they were in legal limbo. Courts were deciding what was going to happen to them. They couldn't be deported from a judge's order, but they also weren't being allowed to proceed with interviews in their asylum claims. And so many of them wanted to speak out about what they were experiencing and how hard it was for them to be in detention with children, but many were afraid to speak to a reporter on the phone after everything they'd been through, after ICE had separated them from their children. They were afraid that that could be done to them again. We talked to them and presented the alternative of writing down in a letter anonymously so that they could have that opportunity.
So basically, in essence, your organization is the only trusting organization to them. They wouldn't entrust this with anybody else, anybody from the news or the government or anybody working there.
Often clients do say that you're the first person who has welcomed me to the United States. And we try to remind them that there are so many people out there who do support them. They just haven't been able to meet them yet because they've been in detention since they got to the border.
So now these 22 women wrote these letters. Were you surprised to hear what they had to say?
I've heard so many horror stories from the border, but working with these reunified families was something new for all of us. Just hearing that extra level of trauma of being separated from a child. It's no wonder that these families got negative decisions in their original interviews because the mothers were just asking over and over for their children. They were threatened that they would be deported without ever seeing their child again, that their child had been given up for adoption. They were told all sorts of lies. It's just unimaginable what they were going through. And the letters, they did a beautiful job of explaining all of that.
So we have some audio tape of the actual letters that were recorded in English. What you're going to hear on the audio tape is our Miami correspondent Anna Ascona reading the letters, but these are the actual words that Anna is reading from the detainees. Nobody helped them draft this. This is their actual words 100%. Is that correct?
Yes.
We're going to hear them all in order, and then we'll discuss it a little bit after.
Elba's story. They started to call children's names and also the name of my son. He was asleep on the floor. I woke him up and told him, "Son, you're going maybe for only a week." We both cried when he said goodbye. We didn't know it was for 75 days. Camilla's story. We have suffered a lot. What the president did to us cannot be described. What will he gain from making so many people suffer in this way? What would he do if they took his child and didn't tell him where they have him and made him a prisoner and gave him dog food like they gave us in Port Isabel jail? Thank God now we're together and my daughter is now recuperating. Sandra's story. The moment they separated me from my son, I felt destroyed. I didn't know what was going to happen to my life because the officials told me that I would never see my son and that he was going to be given up for adoption. For me, those months were so desperate. I didn't even eat or sleep. I felt traumatized, and the worst was when I looked at them and asked for my child. The first thing they said was that he had been given up for adoption. I just cried and cried. Maria's story. We left our country to protect our children and to offer them a better future, not so that they would separate us from them and not for them to treat us like criminals. The mark they left on each one of us, the mothers and children, from having lived this torment, is one of the saddest things in our lives. I thank God for giving me the strength, hope, and will to keep fighting for God. There is no more beautiful miracle than knowing that outside, there are people who are supporting us and that we are not alone.
You know, it's so powerful, this story. What was your reaction when you read them, and what did your organization do with these letters after you read them?
I mean, it was very difficult to read these letters just to hear what our government had done to these families. But each mother said that even though it was difficult to write it, she wanted to go through that in order for more people to know what was going on here so that they could take a stand against the government. And also, each mother has felt that she wanted anything she shared about her story to represent the whole group. There's still 38 families, and we're looking for the release of all of them.
You know, unfortunately, I guess history keeps repeating itself. You wouldn't think that these things would happen in 2018. My family, myself, I have a very close family member who was at age 6 in detention in Greece after World War II, survived the Holocaust, was in detention with her mother as a 6-year-old. And they did not give enough food. And eventually her mother died, which would be the great-grandmother of my children. And she survived, ultimately was raised by other people because she had no mother, raised by her older sisters and brothers. But you would think that it would never happen again. And to this day, this woman who I know, who is in her 70s now, never forgot what that was like. And it really kind of followed her through her entire life and affected her life very negatively, I think. And unfortunately, again, you would think, we learned something from World War II and even World War I and even previous, but apparently not. What do you think of all that?
And we're very concerned about what the effects will be more long-term on these children, because it's difficult for anyone to be in detention, but these are children from 1-year-old to 17 years old, and it's impossible to say how much psychological trauma will play out later in their lives because of this experience. Some of these children have now been detained total by the U.S. government for 6 months. Some of them arrived in May and were separated.
So you yourself got familiar with some of these women, two particularly, Elena and Gloria. Those are their pseudonyms, not their real names, I presume.
Right.
And they have also written letters, and I think you want to share Elena's letter with us.
There's another one that goes along with the campaign that we collaborated on with Amnesty International, where we're asking people to write a letter to the government on the website through a template and request for the release of all of these families. You already heard Isabella's letter. Her name is Gloria in the letter. For Elena, I can read her letter here. I came to the U.S. on May 29th with my 2 children with one goal. We never imagined that we would be separated so long and we'd be treated so badly. My children were far from me, and I didn't know if they were okay, if they were eating or sleeping. I have suffered a lot. My wish is to give the best to my children as a single mother. ICE harmed us a lot psychologically. We can't sleep well because my little girl thinks they are going to separate us again. I thank God because He gave me and continues to give me strength to continue, and I don't lose my faith that we will get out of this place together. They treated me badly because of my color. They laughed at me and they said that I was stained. It was the most difficult thing that could happen. I thank the Dilley Pro Bono Project lawyers that God put them in our paths to give me encouragement and tell us that my children and I are beautiful and that we are all equal. I believe that everyone who has children wouldn't want to go through what we went through, and I say with all my heart that I wouldn't want this to happen to anyone. May God bless you and thank you for thinking of us. We will never forget you. Everything is possible with Christ.
It's very powerful. Most people, how do you wake up every day and say, I want to continue? Is it that they're turning to religion, or do some people kind of just give up? Or how do people get the strength to continue day after day? Or is it simply that they have to because the alternative is even worse.
Many of the families do turn to religion. Many are trying to keep their spirits up by bonding together in this group of 38 women. We have a support group where we'll call all the families together and give them legal updates and ask them how they've been doing, and they've been able to form a little bit of a family in that way. But it is very difficult. Often some of them come to us and they say, I don't know how much longer I can do this. My children have stopped eating. They're depressed. I can suffer myself, but I can't stand to watch my children suffer. And they are at a very low point. And there's only so much that we can tell them.
Is anything going to improve there?
So the families were just allowed to have a new credible fear interview. We had argued that the previous ones were unfair because they were going through the torture of being separated from their children and couldn't focus, and that the children had never been given a chance to testify themselves and have their own interview. So all of the families within the past couple weeks just went through an interview. Many of them have already received positive decisions. We believe the interviews all went well, but the government has not said whether they're going to release the families now or not.
Now, generally speaking, if you came into the airport, you applied for asylum, and you passed the credible fear interview, you were released into the United States until you got to see a judge. So it's not that it's people coming here and just being allowed into America. It's people coming here and making a claim for asylum, having a government officer say, this is a valid claim for asylum. You have credibility, and your case would qualify for asylum. You still have to go see a judge to prove what you're saying. But this is not a situation where just people are come and just allowed into the United States of America. Now, generally in the past, once you passed your credible fear, you were released and paroled into the United States pending your deportation hearing. Do the lawyers feel confident that these families are ever going to be able to leave this facility? Because an asylum hearing could take 2-3 years before it's scheduled. But maybe because they're in detention, it'll be quicker.
We are very much hoping that these families, now that they've been through the interviews and done well in those interviews, will be released any day. But we haven't received confirmation that that will be the case. We know that the government, with recently proposed regulations, is attempting to change the current rules that under the Flores settlement state that children should only be detained for 20 days. We know that they are trying to keep people for months at a time now, as you mentioned, to go through their whole asylum process while in detention instead of being released to go to court.
So those rules aren't even being enforced. I mean, there's children who have been in detention for months and months and months, well over 20 days. Assuming they ultimately get released, which is what we hope and pray for, and you're doing an amazing, incredible, selfless job down there, your organization. Do you think they would ever get over this trauma, or is this something that's going to live with them for the rest of their lives, kind of like one of my family members?
I think that this is something they'll never forget, but I think it's very important that these families go into homes with family members and friends who have agreed to receive them already and have been waiting for them, and begin the process of healing and be together as a family, not having to live in a facility with other families and with guards telling them what to do, and have a normal life so that they can begin that process.
Where can people read these letters in full? You have them from 22 different women. Have you accomplished anything substantively that you can point to say these letters made a difference?
I believe they have, just because of how many more people know about these families now. It's important that all of us hold our government accountable and stand up against these new proposed regulations, and continue to pay attention to family detention. Many people stood up against the government during family separation, and it's important that we don't forget that there are still families in detention, and that detention is not a solution. People can read all of the letters at immigrationjustice.us. That's the Immigration Justice Campaign's website. If you click on the advocacy tab, there's a link that leads to all of the letters, and it tells you different ways that you can help, including signing a letter as part of our collaboration with Amnesty International, asking for the release of all of these families.
How did you get involved in this organization and become so passionate about it?
I had always been interested in human rights and social justice, and I was just horrified. In high school, most of what I had learned about had been in other countries, and I couldn't believe that the way that immigrants were treated was being done with our taxpayer dollars in our name and right here in our country. They did some internships related to immigration, and when I finished grad school, I knew that I wanted to be working in this full time. Working in Dilley has been just an amazing opportunity to be working directly with asylum-seeking families.
And what would you say to the Trump supporters who say, well, we're going to get overrun by immigrants coming from Central America? A lot of them may be criminals. That Trump, I think even tweeted, Middle Eastern terrorists are in this caravans.
The right to seek asylum is protected under international and federal law. It's always been a strong value in the United States to accept immigrants, especially those who have come seeking our help. These are mothers who are afraid that they and their children will be killed if they spend another day in their country. That is the American way to give people a chance. And so we aren't giving someone a free pass into the United States. We're just asking that they get their fair day in court, that they go before a judge.
Usually we like to ask people what your American dream would be.
Yeah, so my dream would be that these children that we've been working with every day can just have a normal childhood, where they can go to school, where they can come home to a house with their family, with their mother, be together with her, but also not be in a detained setting. I think that if people came to Dilley and met just a few of these families, they would realize that these are people that we need to help, often babies who are in a jail, that we as a country should be welcoming and protecting them.
Katy Murzda, very well said. You're the advocacy coordinator with the Dilley Pro Bono Project. Thank you for coming on. We pray for everybody in there that they are released immediately and that they get to live as normal a life as they can. Thank you for coming on, and great work down there.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Brad.
you.